Hey everyone, I'm Nick and welcome back to the channel. If you're a fan of European luxury cars, you probably already know that the Mercedes S-Class is considered the reference for luxury, comfort, and smoothness. After 20 years on the road though, some of the driveline components on mine are starting to wear out, giving me vibrations at idle and at highway speeds. Today we're going to fix that by replacing the engine mounts and the driveshaft flex discs. So let's get to it. The first thing we're going to do after getting the car in the air is remove the under trays so we can access the bottom of the engine. With the one directly under the engine, be careful when you pull it out because there's two ducts that you don't want to damage. With those two out of the way, we're ready to do this job. Alright, so to do the front engine mounts, we have a couple things to do first. I'm going to pull off this cover right here. Move that aside. I'm going to pull off the air intake hoses. Put those aside. Now we can take a look at where things are. So on our driver's side, that is our engine mount. And if I actually get in here a little further, you can see the top bolt right there, which is a 16. And on the other side, that's the engine mount there, and the bolt is right there. Now, on the driver's side, you can actually just look from down here and see it. And on the passenger side, to get a good line of sight while you're working on it, you can actually come here and you can kind of see it through there. So while you're aligning your tool, you can look through here so you can see if it's in place. Now, Mercedes procedure would have you remove everything here, pull your belt off, take your alternator off, power steering pump off, maybe even the AC compressor so you can get in there, pull your mounts out, and work from this side. But that is a huge job. You need to drain the power steering fluid, you gotta evacuate your AC system and refill it later. So we're going to do it a little differently. Now the first step is unbolting the top bolts on the engine mounts. And that, it's a tight space in there. A little less on this side, but still tough to get to. So what we want is a 16mm tool like this. What this allows us to do is pop it on, put in a couple extensions in here, and break those free and start working them loose. Without this, you may be better off taking all the accessories out and reassembling it later. But if you want to leave them in place, using this is a lot easier. Now, you'll see there's kind of an angle on this tool, and if we put it on the bolt there, this way, the angle on the socket will be pointing kind of towards the engine. So what I found is actually dropping it on in this orientation lets you get the extensions at a good angle, and I was able to break it free. So let me show you how that looks. Now, what I was able to do, I have pretty small hands, but I was able to reach in, pop it on. Ooh, my thumb's stuck. I'll use my right hand. Here we go. Get that in there. Then I got two of these. See right there? Then I was able to look in here. I moved my flashlight, but make sure that it's nice and in the right place. And then you might need to use both of your hands, but you want to turn. Now this might take a little while because every time you turn it, you'll have to reposition it. So you can go this far, then you have to move it another step over and keep going. Then once it's loose enough, you can kind of just move and reposition this or reach in by hand. If it's really loose enough, we'll see. And work it free. I'm gonna need to go a little further. Same thing on the other side. Put it on like this, can reach in. It's a little easier to get to. Be careful around the hoses and pivot, loosen that. This one's easier to access, so once it's broken free, you can put your tool in, a little stubby wrench in, and get it going like that. It shouldn't be crazy tight because the torque spec on the top is 55 Newton meters. Actually, I can do it by hand now. That's good. Yeah, there we go. Nice. Okay. I can work on getting that side loose and we'll keep going. On the underside, we're not quite ready to remove everything, but right here by the steering rack, there's a 13mm bolt. That's the bottom bolt for the engine mount. Same thing on the other side right here. And you can see over here, the engine mount's right there. You may be able to work to loosen the bolt from here. Now, on the driver's side, things are slightly less accessible because of the steering rack, but we'll deal with that in a little bit. Kind of see it up here. Yep. But fortunately that one's a little easier to reach from the top to get it loose, but it is right there. Now, while we're here, I want to point out these bolts, because we will be loosening these. We'll be removing these completely and loosening these to make some room by dropping the steering rack slightly out of the way. And that will give us room to reach in here to pull the engine mount out when the time comes. Now right here, I've actually been able to reach in, put the tool in there. Well, I was able to. And continue unscrewing. So once it's free, you may do better working from here. So I'm gonna keep doing that, get that top one free. All right, so now that we've undone the bolts, we're gonna support the engine. So there's two ways to do this. You could use a couple 2x4s on a jack and support from the oil pan, or use this lift point right here and an engine support bar. Now this sits on the bodywork edges here. And we're gonna get this started, lift it up maybe a couple inches so that we can free the engine mounts. Okay, that's loose here.
With the top bolts loose, we can unbolt the bottom 13mm bolts as well. I had to use a breaker bar on the other side because it was a little too tight for my impact gun.
Now with the engine lifted up enough, see the engine mount is free here, but can't really fit it through here. On the other side, you can see it here as well. I'm gonna see if I can bring that out maybe through the back here. Yep. Boom, that is out. Does it fit through here? No, I guess not. I'm gonna pull this rubber cover off, see if that helps. We're getting new ones. Close, but no. Maybe if the engine comes up a little higher, I can pull this out, but I'm gonna try something different. Because on this side, right here, if we lower the power steering rack, we should be able to get this out through here. That may give us enough room to pull it out through here on the other side.
To loosen the power steering rack, the bolts and nuts are all 18mm. We're completely removing the forward bolts and only loosening the rear bolts. As I found out soon after this, I wasn't able to raise the engine enough with just my support bar from the top, so I ended up using a jack as well. The reason I mention this now is that with the engine raised up a little higher, you can get much easier access to the nuts that hold the power steering rack plate. When you raise the engine, keep an eye on this hose, which is what will limit how high we can go. To make the engine mounts a little easier to remove, I pulled off the rubber covers ahead of time.
That's our passenger side out, okay. Woo. All right, there we go. All right, so these are our new parts. Limfarter. So part 2540201 but the Mercedes part is A211 240 0517. And what's nice is they do come with a new cover, so you don't have to reuse your old ones if you get these parts. Looking at this, yeah, you can see as it collapsed a little bit. They're quite a bit shorter, so that should make a nice difference when we get the new ones in. So that's good. Both sides are the same. They're just gonna fit in, oriented a little differently. Gonna slide this in and then put the cover on. And the cover only fits on. It's like set up so it doesn't turn with this pin here. So let's get that in. Oh, and I did end up taking this wheel off and using the jack with blocks of wood because I couldn't quite raise it enough with the engine support bar. But with both, if anything happened to the check, the engine is still supported and won't collapse onto the subframe. So, taking the new mount like this. Gotta slide it, position it right. Boom.
With the cover in place, I'll just have to rotate it into the right position before bolting it down. With the engine mounts in, we can put the steering rack back into place while the engine is raised up.
We're going to torque these. The rear ones go to 110 Newton meters, which is the plate to the axle carrier. Put this in on the top. Oh, ow, right in my face, ow. Oh. Now the rack to the plate here. And it's 70 Newton meters first. So we're gonna get that started.
For the nuts on the forward bolts, I'm using an 18mm wrench to hold it in place.
And then we do 90 degrees. Ow. Alright, with that secured in, what that means we'll be able to lower the engine back down, not have to worry about getting space for these again. So now what we want to do is get the thread started for the top bolts. You may be able to see right here on the outside. That will align with the spike that also holds the rubber cover. that gap there. If I bring this up here, you can see the little spike. So I'm going to lower the engine a little bit more. Should be able to get the thread started. I've lowered the jack that supported the oil pan, and now I have to start lowering from the top, which gives me a little more control because it's a screw. And we're gonna lower it. We're gonna lower it until I can fit these in and thread those in. That way we'll make sure everything's aligned when we lower it all the way. Now we can tighten everything up. All right, so I started lowering it. The top bolt is in loosely, but enough to hold it secure so it doesn't fall out of the way. Now down here, I'm gonna align the hole there with the threads. Put the bolt in and get that started so that it's aligned, so everything will settle in the right position. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. So we want to lower this little by little so that we can still move the mount around, but get the thread started on the bottom bolt. It's on. Straight to the other side. Of course, as this lowers, I have less clearance for my hands.
With the upper and lower bolts started, we can lower the engine down and then tighten them further. For the top bolts, I worked from the bottom and the top, depending on which was easier. It took a while because of the space constraints. And then we can torque them to spec.
Alright, so we're going to torque the top bolts on the engine mounts. Normally they go to 55 Newton meters, but we are using an extension on the torque wrench that makes it longer. So there's a slight difference in how we're going to do it. So I've done a quick calculation, and since this has 3.5 inches and my torque wrench is 13 inches to the center of the handle from the center here, it comes out to 43.3 Newton meters to account for this. Now that's only if this is straight in line. So if we end up offset, we'll be slightly lower than the target torque. So we're going to try to get this straight in line. Now I'm also using 2 extensions to go down, but those, if they're in line with this axis, don't affect the torque we need. We're going like this, the angle towards us. There we go. Alright, that's the top done. Let's go take care of the bottom. For the bottom, we don't need anything special. No calculations, it's just 35 Newton meters. So for the bottom bolt, if you want a little extra peace of mind, you can use blue thread locker, so we can pull it out, put some on, and get it back in and torque it to spec. Alright, so we're going to 35 Newton meters down here. If you want to pull them out, put some blue Loctite on, put them back in, now's the time. I actually just did that. I thought I filmed it, but I missed it. Alright, and that is our new engine mounts. Now I'm going to leave this uncovered still because we will be supporting the engine again for the rear engine mount, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Now there's a reason I started with the front engine mounts, and that's because when we raise the engine up, it kind of pivots on the rear engine mount, and that is by the transmission. Now if you put that one in first, pivoting it up may actually damage the rubber when you're doing the front mounts, and then you'd have to replace it again anyway. So that's why I'm doing that next. All right, so now moving back a little further,
This here is the rear engine mount that mounts the transmission, and right above it is the first flex disc. So you can probably kind of see here, there's a little bit of cracking in the rubber there. So we're going to be replacing this and this. Now this transmission mount, so the rear engine mount, is mounted on this cross member here, and using these two bolts to the transmission. To remove it, we're gonna have to support the engine and transmission, or just the transmission, and then that'll allow us to remove this bar and then remove this. So we're gonna unbolt these two, unbolt these 6, and then once this is out of the way, unbolt those two, pull that out. Then either you can put your new mount in, or keep going and remove this and replace it. Before we work on the flex disc, we gotta keep moving back a little bit, and there's a carrier bearing right here. So that bolts to the body right there and right here, and we're gonna loosen that just so that when we work on the flex disc up here, so that when we pull the flex disc out of the way, we don't put any stress on the carrier bearing. Then when we reassemble all that, we'll go to the back, do the rear flex disc, and then we'll tighten the carrier bearing back up, and we'll be good to go. Okay, so to start, I'm gonna loosen the carrier bearing, support bearing, bolts. These are 13s. And we're not removing these, we're just loosening them. Now over here, I'm gonna loosen the 2 bottom bolts, which are also 13s, or just remove them, I guess, for the transmission mount. Good. Unfortunately, the way my quick jacks are set up, I don't have a ton of room. I need to get a wobble socket. Well, it looks good. It's just loose already. And we're gonna have to support the engine anyway before we go any further, but okay. Yeah, that's just straight up. It's just supported. I don't get it. Huh. Okay, well, let's go put an extra support so this doesn't tip down. But yeah, the reason we didn't replace this before doing the front engine mounts is that tipping the engine up will flex the rubber internals and it could rip it. Meaning that it's better to do that to the old one than to the new one we're gonna put in. Now, as you can see here, my transmission pan is partially covered by the quick jack, and the first thing I wanted to do was to get like a thick piece of wood that's the whole size of the pan to support it, but since I can't fit that, I won't be doing that. Some people are comfortable just putting 2x4s on this and supporting it there, but I'm just gonna go to this point right here, use a 2x4 on my jack, and just get it so that it's touching there. And you know, we're not lifting or anything, we're just gonna support it. So let me get that in place. Okay, just supporting. Now these bolts here are 16s. Actually, the bolts that bolt the transmission to the transmission mount are also 16s. Now I just want to point out here that if you're only doing the transmission mount, you may not need to remove this cross member, but I'm going to remove it because we need a little better access to do the flex disc. So remember these holes right here, these holes right here will go towards the rear. Actually, this should only fit on one way because 2 of the holes are closer to each other. All right, you can see this is pretty tired. Oh yeah, it's like ripped. I'll show you when I get it out. So these are 16s also. And right here, there's a ground strap. that goes to the body. So generally the recommendation is if you are working on anything with the electrical system, unplug the battery. So my battery is unplugged. And we will have to make sure we reattach this when we put the new mount in. I actually wonder if this was loose from the plate here because A, this is worn out, and B, our front engine mounts are brand new. So maybe they're like stiff enough that they can hold everything up. I wouldn't bank on that, that's why I put the jack under it to support it, but oh, and these are longer for these bolts, so you won't be able to get them mixed up with this. Not the easiest to see, but you can see that's ripped in there. And there, it's yeah, pretty tired. So as you can see, this is angled, so when we put it back on for the new one, we'll want to make sure we set it up so that the bottom is flat. I mean, otherwise you won't even be able to mount the support plate. As you can see right here, the flex disc mounts big Torx bit on this side and 18mm bolts or nuts on the other side. So these are T60s and the backs are 18s. But before we do anything here, we have to make a couple of markings. We want to make sure we put this all back together the same way. And you'll notice right here, there's like a thin segment and a thick segment. So we're going to want to make sure our thick segments are in the same place, you know, because it's designed to be stronger in a certain direction, and presumably drive. And we got to keep that in mind. We also want to make sure our drive shaft and flange back here are aligned. So I'm actually going to mark this right here and this with a paint pen so that I know to realign those. And I'm going to make a little mark somewhere to remind myself that the thick part will where that goes. So we're also going to have to put the car into neutral so that I can actually work my way around, because in park it won't turn at all. Another thing I want to point out before I take this off is, as you can see, we have the Torx side and the other side is the nut side, but we also get a set of 6 washers. Now, the way this is going to go is the washer will always go between the bolt and the flex disc. So if right here, see, the bolt is touching metal, we don't have a washer. Here the bolt is touching the rubber, so we have a washer. Now on the other side of this, right here, there's going to be a washer and then the nut. There's also something else. The flex disc has little metal sleeves inside it, and they stick out on one side, so it's going to be, you're going to match the part that sticks out with the flange, so they'll slot in to stay in position. Take a picture just to make sure I have all that, and we get started on removing this. Oh yeah, I need to get the car in neutral too. Probably want to do that before you disconnect the battery if you're disconnecting the battery. Okay. You know what? Oop. I can break them free with that and get my power tool. Now we're not reusing these. We're getting a whole new set. Also, there's a rounded side. Yeah, so the rounded side of the nut will go away from the disc.
Now I just have to remove the other 5 bolts.
I have to get this out, and I think we get a pry bar so we can kind of very slightly shift these apart. You can see here I can move it apart, but I also have to separate it from the little standoff. You can see it in there. That slots into the flange. And this one's still kind of stuck. There we go. That's the front side off. Yep, now we have to pry the back off too. for the drive shaft slide back. We gotta get this out. Go. Good. And one thing we want to do before we put this back together is put grease in here. So I'm gonna kind of shove a bit in there, so we don't want that to cause any issues. Let's get our new disc nice and clean. So we're gonna look here. I'm gonna look at my picture again. That's yours. Goes here. There's got my thick part here. That's aligned with that. We're gonna go around. You can also see this is the flush part. The raised part is right here, so facing this. So that is good. I guess I could start putting the new Torx bolts in. Now because the blue bolts are a little shorter, I'm putting them on the flange for the transmission and putting the regular length gray ones, or the longer length gray ones, on the drive shaft flange. So they're gonna be alternating, and that makes it a little easier to get around behind it when you go to service the flex disc. All right, so we have, since we're starting here, this is gonna be metal towards the flex disc, so we're gonna put a washer first. Okay. And then again on the back, there's a rounded side and a flat side. We want the rounded side to be away from the disc to reach in. Now on this side, we have the flange, so the washer will go on the back. And we'll keep going.
You might notice here that the bolts aren't in the right place, and that's because I made a mistake. I ended up having to go back to put them in the right place once I realized.
All right, so these go to 60 Newton meters. If you're having trouble keeping the drive shaft in place, you could probably pop it back into park.
And that's the flex disc in place.
This is our new mount. This is the original one. It's tired. You can see some cracking there. Looks good here. So this is part 3387501-009. So let's get this in. So we got our long bolts here. We got our new mount here. That is not the right orientation. There we go. Let's put our, let's get this side started. Now these two bolts go to 50 Newton meters. Now we can get our plate back in. I'll probably have to check up the engine a tiny bit, but I'm gonna get these bolts started. And I can put my little guys in here. And the torque spec I found for this cross member is 40 Newton meters. And then the torque spec for the 213s for the transmount is 30 Newton meters. Then we can lower the jack. Back here it's basically the same thing. We're gonna mark our drive shaft and flanges so they align. See right here, same as before, the washer is between either the bolt or the nut and the disc. There's no washer when it's contacting metal. So I'm gonna put a little mark here, say this is where I get the thick side. Same torque size, same nut size. So yeah, and we're gonna need to use the open side of the wrench on the flange on the diff because it won't go around otherwise, but we have good access, so it should be all good. And the carrier bearing is still loose.
With the bolts out, we need to separate the flex disc from the flanges. It was a little harder to do here, probably because it's more exposed to the elements. I also managed to get hit in the face one last time for this job.
Oh, Ow, right in the face. Now the disc free, we just gotta move the drive shaft out of the way enough to get this out. Boom, and there we go. Let's get our thing lined up here. Let's check the photo I took. Bolts go from this side. Washer goes on the side that's touching the flex disc. We're gonna make sure our little raised parts go towards the flange. Raised part there. We'll flat on this side. Rounded part of the nut away from the disc. And we have our thick side of the flex disc here by my little mark there. And I was like, wow, that's turning really well. It's not, it wasn't thready. All right, whoops. Okay, so the blue ones are slightly shorter so that they don't bump into this. All right, whoops.
Now that I've realized the blue bolts are shorter, I'm putting them on the differential flange so that they don't stick out. This is when I realized I'd have to go back to the front flex disc to fix the bolts that were in the wrong place, which I did off camera. The torque for these bolts is 60 Newton meters, just like the other flex disc.
See right here, the blue ones are a little shorter, so they're flat flush here. So that's what those are for. With everything torqued to spec, front and rear, we're gonna reposition our carrier bearing mount. We're gonna recenter it where it was with the markings. And we're gonna torque it down to 30 Newton meters. All right, and that's the driveline work done. I'm happy to have my daily driver back, though I have been driving the $2,000 S-Class while this one was in here, and that's been surprisingly good for a 24-year-old S-Class with 200,000 miles. Check out that rebuild if you haven't seen it yet. If you enjoyed this video, let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like. If you want to see more Mercedes content, subscribe, because my $600 Supercharged C-Class is coming back soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.